Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. Glad to have you with me. So, on yesterday's program, the radio program, I talked a little bit about the London stabbing incident. It occurred on Friday. That attack has the potential to impact the upcoming elections in the United Kingdom. But what it really did is it really heightened attention to what amounts to almost a terrorist catch and release program. And it's paired with the type of punishments that might be typical for, quite honestly, an American teenager. An internet ban, a curfew, movement tracking. The killing of two people by a convicted terrorist on early release from prison has highlighted what is a really growing challenge for security services in the United Kingdom, and for that matter, all across Europe. And that is, what do you do with people who have served time in jail for terrorism offenses? The attack in the London Bridge area this past Friday by this knife-wielding dirtbag was convicted in 2012 for being part of a group that was plotting to bomb the London Stock Exchange. Well, his attack has thrust the sentencing of terrorists to center stage in the December 12 general election coming up in the United Kingdom. It is the second consecutive general election campaign that has been interrupted by a terrorist incident. 2 years ago, in 2017, a nearby attack, virtually in almost the same place, left 11 people dead. That attack alone raised questions about cutbacks in funding for the police. But here we are 2 years later, nothing's changed. And I think this attack even more egregiously points out, what do you do with these people? Now, in the United States, we worry about Guantanamo. Oh, we got all these terrorists in Gitmo who will be there forever. It's different for a terrorist, in my opinion, significant legal difference, of someone who is taken on the battlefield, who is plucked out of Yemen or somewhere else because they were actually planning some sort of terrorist attack or were involved in the planning of 9/11, whatever it might be. We take them to Gitmo, and there they can just live out the rest of their lives. But what do you do with someone who is arrested for a terrorist activity in the United States or a country like the United Kingdom? I think, many people disagree with me, but I think that if we arrest someone on American soil for terrorism-related charges or for even an act of terrorism, let's take 9/11, for example. Let's say that on 9/11, one of the hijackers had survived, and we had saved his life. I mean, that's exactly what the first responders do. We had saved that individual's life. Would we send that individual to Gitmo? No, because he had committed a crime on American soil. Now, that crime might have been an act of terrorism, but it was nonetheless a crime. He would have been charged with 2,900 counts of murder, destruction of property. I mean, so many felonies I can't even count them. He would have had thousands of felonies filed against him. And if he had been convicted at trial, receiving all the due process he's entitled to as being someone on American soil, he would have been sent to probably multiple life sentences and would die in prison. But in the UK, apparently not. The question of how to monitor convicted terrorists returning into society is a growing issue for stretched counterterrorism policy and security agencies in the United Kingdom and all across Europe. It's a parallel with the challenge they face from jihadists returning from the Syrian conflict. The problem in the United Kingdom is they take them and they give them light sentences and then they let them out. Now, you might say, for example, that the recidivism rate, the rate at which a convicted murderer, for example, if a convicted murderer is released, what's the recidivism rate? What's the likelihood of them going to murder again? I'll tell you, I don't know the answer to that question. I do know the answer to this question. What do you think the recidivism rate would be for a jihadist who has committed terrorism on American soil? I would guess that recidivism rate would be about 100%. That if we were to jail them and give them a 25-year sentence, that they're more likely than not, once they are released, to commit another act of jihad, another act of terrorism, which is why I think you need to have different kinds of sentencing for someone who commits an act of terror. That's something the United Kingdom has not done. Hussein Khan, the attacker, was released early from prison in December 2018 under a set of conditions that included, these are hilarious, an internet ban, a curfew, and limitations on his movements and his meetings. Now, he did have a GPS tag. He had an ankle monitor that allowed authorities to track his whereabouts, and he had been given custodial sentence of 15 years. He had served 8 years from his arrest back in 2010. Well, he ends up being shot and killed on the London Bridge after being confronted by members of the public. He had been wearing a fake suicide vest. The Islamic State terrorist group said and claimed that Khan was one of its fighters, but the group has claimed responsibility for other attacks without evidence later emerging of its involvement. Khan's group drew its inspiration in 2010 from an al-Qaeda affiliate, according to UK prosecutors. Then Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Sunday said there were around 74 other convicted terrorists who had been released early from prison, and that the cops in the UK were now ensuring that they're properly supervised. Well, what? Making sure they don't have access to the internet, that they're complying with their curfew, that they're limiting their movements. That would take 24-hour, 7-day-a-week surveillance, and I doubt they're going to do that. So in response to questions on the release of terrorists generally, Jeremy Corbyn, the opposition candidate to the prime minister, says that they should not be forced to serve full sentences in prison. He said, quote, terrorists should not be forced to serve their full sentences in prison. The Labour leader was asked by Sky News' Sophie Ridge whether those convicted of terror offenses should serve their sentences in full. He said, I think it depends on the circumstances and depends on the sentence and crucially depends on what they've done in prison. So he was pressed by Ridge, who asked him, not necessarily then? And he said, not necessarily, no. That's the kind of liberal thinking that's going to continue to get Brits, and quite frankly, that kind of thinking in America will continue to get Americans killed. I think if you're convicted of a terrorist event, of a terrorist crime, then part of that sentence should be life without parole. Because I don't want to take the risk that someone that, but for the fact they committed the act on American soil, if they were committing that same act in Yemen or Saudi Arabia or Iraq, Afghanistan, they would continually repeat that act over and over and over again. And I don't know why either the UK or the United States would be fooled into thinking, oh, but they committed the crime here, so we're going to treat it as a crime, but when it comes to sentencing, we don't think they should have to fill out or complete their full sentences. I think they should. And I think those sentences, quite frankly, ought to be life without parole. Now, that means you're going to have to very narrowly and very critically define what a terrorist event is, because, quite frankly, that can be used to ensnare people that aren't committing terrorist events except in name only. Now, Tim Stanley writes, hurrah for the British stiff upper lip. Hurrah for Thomas Gray. He was driving his Mini across London Bridge last Friday when he saw a terrorist being chased by some men with a fire extinguisher. He jumped out of his car and joined them as they pinned the fanatic to the ground. They stomped on Usman Khan's wrists till he dropped the knives. Then the police shot Khan dead. Gray said, one thought was going through my mind. Stop the dude. I've played rugby for most of my life, and the rule on and off the pitch is one in, all in. So what did he do after helping to save the day? The British thing, said Mr. Gray. He went to the pub. Well, boom, bash, bosh. Doesn't that make you proud? Somebody is actually fighting back against these nut jobs. You know, one of the worst things about terrorism is it actually makes you feel vulnerable in your own home, in your own country. And the coddling of big government almost encourages that. The official advice in the event of a terrorist attack, here and elsewhere, run, hide, and tell, which is sensible, but it's also kind of depressing. You know, we've kind of lost the spirit of, run into the danger, run into the fire, do what you can to save others. I don't know what effect the attack will have on the UK elections, but I do know this. I think there's a lesson in it for us in the United States. And that is that if we're going to convict people on American soil, now remember, I want to make a very clear distinction between those who commit terrorist acts on American soil and are captured on American soil versus those who commit terrorist acts on foreign soil and are captured on foreign soil. I say send them to Gitmo and let them end up dying in Gitmo. In the United States, they're entitled to due process. They're entitled to face the charges. They're entitled to a fair trial. They're entitled to a jury of their peers. No jokes inserted there, but they are entitled to a jury of their peers. And if they are convicted in the United States of committing a terrorist attack on American soil, then I think part of the sentencing of that ought to be life without parole. Otherwise, we're going to see a recidivism rate that's going to shock us because we're going to let these people out of jail, and the next thing you know, it may take them a while because they're patient. They're not going to do it on the day they get released, but after months or a couple of years, they'll be right back to committing jihad. You want proof of that? Just look at the United Kingdom. Now let's switch gears for a minute. Let's talk about a different kind of terrorism. There's apparently a lot more death along the southern border again. Mexican security forces have now killed 7 more members of a presumed cartel a day after clashing with a group of heavily armed gang members. I keep telling everybody Mexico is getting closer and closer to a failed state every day. 4 officers died and 6 were wounded in the hour-long confrontation on Saturday in the northern town of Villa Union, about 65 kilometers, 40 miles or so, from the U.S. border. The group reportedly entered the town of 3,000 inhabitants in a convoy of pickup trucks before storming local government buildings at around midday. Governor Miguel Angel, I'm not sure how to pronounce this last name, Riquelme, said this, speaking outside the bullet-ridden town mayor's office. He said the state had acted, quote, decisively to repel the gunmen. He said they were members of the cartel of the Northeast, which is from the neighboring state of Tamaulipas. A number of municipal workers were missing, he added. Now, there's a piece in the New York Post this weekend that says the cartel killing of 9 U.S. citizens, 3 women and 6 children in Mexico this month forced Americans to confront a discomforting and undeniable fact. Our neighbor to the south increasingly resembles a failed state, where corruption and trafficking are a way of life, and the only law is the law of the cartel. Well, now President Trump says that he wants to take a significant step, designating the cartels as a terrorist group. Good for him. He should actually do that. The current Mexican government has proved to be deeply unserious about confronting the cartel threat. Assassinations are rampant. The cartels have emerged as almost exactly as a parallel government in some areas. Now, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, his hugs not bullets approach, I mean, that's literally his approach, hugs not bullets, is actually laughable. It says everything about Mexican political priorities, that the Mexican Air Force is able to spirit away Bolivia's recently ousted leftist president, but it is unable to render support to Mexico's own ground forces in the skies over Culiacan, where the Sinaloa cartel recently defeated the Mexican military in an 8-hour battle. I don't know how much more evidence Americans need that Mexico is getting close to a failed state. The Air Force can't do anything. The Mexican Army defeated. The cartels operating almost as if they are parallel governments. And the United States just looks on with bewilderment. You're going to think bewilderment when and if Mexico actually does become a failed state and the cartels take over. Now, I don't know physically what would happen. I do believe, based on my experience in Homeland Security and studying what we would do when the Castro boys died, the same thing is true in Mexico. There would be this huge flood of refugees. And these refugees are not going to show up at border crossings. They're going to flee their towns, they're going to flee their villages, and they're going to hit the Rio Grande, and they're going to cross wherever, however they can, and they will do so by the thousands. And unless we're willing to send the military to secure the border, we will not be able to stop them. And if we're unable to stop them, that border will just virtually disappear. Then what do we do? Do we move in? Does the United States military move in and take over the government? I mean, I know that sounds bizarre, but I want you to think about that and consider that. A failed state. Now, I don't know that we should necessarily, and I'm not even advocating this, I don't know that we should move into Mexico and then permanently stay there and make that the 51st state. But I think in order to prevent China, Russia, any other countries from infiltrating and stamping their view of government on Mexico is good. So we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to step in. It doesn't mean that we take over the country, except for maybe a temporary status. But we have to protect the Mexican people. We have to give them a chance to reformulate and restructure their government if it becomes a failed state. And the more stories that I hear and that I read about the Mexican military failing to do this at a national level, or the municipal governments and the state governments unable to control the cartels, the more I think we are on a fast track to Mexico becoming a failed state. And I don't want Americans caught off guard. I want Americans to realize that if that happens, we might have to do something. And I want you to think about what that something is. Again, I'm not advocating that we run in and we take over everything with the expectation that as evil imperialists, that we're going to stay there and take control and just make it another state, make it another part of the United States. But I do think we're going to have to commit resources. We're going to have to commit the military. We're going to have to commit USAID. We're going to have to do a whole heck of a lot of things to enable the Mexican people to reestablish their own government. If we don't do it, you want the Chinese to do it? Do you want the Chinese to get Mexican resources, all of their natural resources? Do you want Russia to do that? Do you want Maduro in Venezuela to do that? I don't think we want any of those countries to do that, which means that we have to do it. That's one of the disadvantages of being a superpower. That's one of the reasons why in Hong Kong, for example, they look to us for support. I think the Mexicans will look to us for support. And I think we have to be ready to do it. And I want you to be thinking about that situation. Thanks for listening to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. You know the drill. I would ask you to share the podcast. You can get it on iHeart, iTunes, Spreaker, wherever you happen to download podcasts. But do me a favor. I'd ask you to share the link to the podcast with your friends to help us grow the numbers. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.